You think a clumsy mistake is going to cost me $1 million contract? I felt the shove before I heard the glass shatter. Marina's foot hooked behind mine right at the center of the VIP floor, directly under the crystal chandelier where the entire city's elite could see my failure. Mr. Yu, I'm so sorry. Let me help you. Shut up and get out, Caleb hissed, his hand clamping onto my upper arm like a vice. You're done here, Zuri. Forever. 3 years of double shifts, recycled bus passes, and skipping meals just to keep the lights on in a studio apartment that barely held my bed. 3 years of staying invisible, and it all ended on the front of a $3,000 tuxedo. We need to discuss your termination outside, Caleb said, his smile as fake as the diamonds on the guests' necks, acting like he was doing me a favor while he dragged me toward the service exit. I yanked back. Let go! I can walk myself out! He didn't. The string quartet didn't stop playing. The laughter at the nearby tables continued. A woman in a gold gown glanced at my stained apron, then turned back to her lobster. A man in a tuxedo checked his Rolex. Caleb's grip tightened, his fingers digging into the bruise he'd given me last week when I turned down his private dinner invitation. I dug my heels into the plush carpet, but he was stronger. He had the money, the name, and the power. He was always stronger. That's when he raised his hand to strike me. Caleb's hand stayed midair, a jagged silhouette against the amber glow of the chandeliers. I braced for the impact, my eyes squeezing shut as I waited for the sting that usually followed his temper. But the blow never came. Instead, the air in the room seemed to vanish, replaced by a cold, heavy pressure that made my skin prickle. That's enough. The voice was like velvet, wrapped around a blade. I opened my eyes to see Caleb's wrist caught in a grip so fast I hadn't even seen it move. Yu Ji-hoon didn't stand up. He remained seated, his dark, swept-back hair perfectly in place despite the red wine dripping from his lapel onto his waistcoat. His expression was a mask of bored intensity, but his eyes were locked on Caleb with a look that promised a very slow, very painful end to the night. Mr. Yu, Caleb stammered, his face draining of color. I was just taking out the trash. This girl is incompetent. She's fired. I'll have security take her to the back. She doesn't work for you. Ji-hoon's voice was barely a whisper, yet it cut through the gasps of the women in their evening gowns and the hushed murmurs of the men in tuxedos. He slowly released Caleb's arm, dismissive of the man as if he were nothing more than an annoying insect. With a deliberate motion, Ji-hoon reached into the inner pocket of his wine-stained jacket. The room held its breath. I thought he was reaching for a weapon. I think everyone did. Caleb actually took a step back, his hands trembling. But Ji-hoon didn't pull out a gun. He pulled out a small, red, velvet box. He flipped it open with his thumb. Under the focus light of the chandelier, the diamond inside looked like it was made of captured stars. It was too big, too bright, and far too intentional to be a mistake. She belongs with me, Ji-hoon stated, his gaze finally shifting to mine. The silence was absolute. Marina, standing just a few feet away, looked like she had been turned to stone, her mouth hanging open in a silent scream of shock. To the right, guests clutched their champagne flutes, frozen in mid-motion. Ji-hoon didn't wait for my permission. He reached out with a tattooed hand and took my trembling fingers in his. His skin was warm, a sharp contrast to the icy terror that had been holding me captive. He slid the ring onto my finger, the weight of the metal feeling like a shackle and a shield all at once. My fiancé has had a long evening, he said, finally standing up to his full, imposing height. He looked down at Caleb, whose mouth was working but producing no sound. The next time you think about putting your hands on what is mine, remember whose blood is currently drying on your floor. He didn't look back at the chaos he'd created. He just started walking, his hand firm on the small of my back, guiding me away from the spilled wine and toward a future I wasn't sure I'd survive. The cool night air hit my face like a physical shock, but it did little to dull the frantic thrumming of my heart. Ji-hoon didn't slow his pace, his hand a heavy, grounding anchor on my back as he led me toward the curb where a sleek black sedan sat idling. Its tinted windows reflecting the city's neon glow like oil on water. A man I didn't recognize held the door open, his posture as rigid as a soldier's. I hesitated at the threshold of that dark leather interior, the diamond on my finger catching the streetlights and mocking me with its weight. "Get in, Zuri," Ji-hoon said. It wasn't a request, yet it lacked the jagged cruelty of Caleb's bark. It was the calm command of a man who moved the world simply by breathing. I slid inside, the door closing with a thud that sounded far too much like a vault sealing shut. The interior smelled of expensive tobacco and something sharp, like ozone before a storm. I wasn't alone. Seated in the shadows of the far corner was a woman who made the air in the car feel twice as thin. Her hair was pulled back into a ponytail so tight it looked painful, and her eyes, dark and predatory, swept over me with the clinical detachment of a butcher. "This is her?" she asked, her voice a low rasp that made the hair on my arms stand up. "This is Zuri," Ji-hoon replied, settling into the seat beside me. "Zuri, this is Lee Haerin. She handles the things I don't have the patience for." Haerin's gaze dropped to my hand to the ring that felt like a hot coal against my skin. A small, dangerous smile touched her lips. "A bold move, Ji-hoon, even for you. Do you think she can survive the target you just painted on her back?" My throat went dry. "A target?" Haerin leaned forward, the light hitting a thin silver scar that ran along her jawline. "You're not just a waitress anymore, girl. You're a claim. To half the men in this city, that ring isn't a promise of marriage, it's an invitation to see how much it takes to make Ji-hoon bleed. You aren't his fiancée. You're his greatest vulnerability." I looked at Ji-hoon, searching for a denial, but he was staring straight ahead, his jaw set in a hard, uncompromising line. He didn't tell her she was wrong. He didn't tell me I was safe. He just reached out, his gloved hand covering mine, pinning the diamond against my finger. The luxury of the sedan suddenly felt like a cage, and for the first time, I realized that while Ji-hoon had saved me from Caleb, he had ushered me into a war where fiancé was just another word for casualty.
The estate was a fortress of glass and silence, tucked so far into the hills that the city lights looked like fallen embers. I spent the first morning wandering the cavernous halls, my reflection ghosting across polished marble, until the smell of bleach and chicory pulled me toward the rear of the house. I pushed open a heavy oak door, expecting a gleaming, high-tech kitchen. Instead, I found a woman standing over a steaming industrial sink, her back to me, scrubbing a copper pot with rhythmic, violent precision. "You're late for breakfast." "Child," she said without turning. I froze. Etta. The woman who had spent years hunched over the dish pit at Hawthorne's turned around. Etta Raines didn't look like a weary grandmother here. She wore a sharp charcoal apron, and her eyes lacked the tired film I'd grown used to seeing. She dried her hands on a towel and looked me up and down, her gaze lingering on the diamond ring that felt like a lead weight on my hand. "I didn't know you worked for him," I whispered, my voice echoing in the sterile room. "I don't work for him. I helped raise him," Etta replied, stepping closer. "And I've been waiting for you to realize that a ring is just a piece of metal until you know how to use it as a brass knuckle." She led me to a heavy steel table and slammed a paring knife down in front of me. "Caleb Hawthorne treated you like a porcelain doll he could break for fun. Ji-hoon treats you like a queen. Both of those roles will get you killed in this world." I looked at the knife, then back at her. "I don't understand. Ji-hoon said I was safe here." "Safe is a lie people tell to those they think are weak," Etta snapped. She grabbed my wrist, the one Caleb had bruised, and forced my hand over the handle of the blade. "Survival isn't a miracle, Zuri. It's a craft. You've been surviving on instinct and prayer, but out there, you need steel. You need to know that every person who smiles at the fiancé is looking for the seam in your armor." She spent the next hour showing me things that had nothing to do with service. She taught me how to watch a doorway in a reflection, how to hide a tremor in my fingers by locking my elbows, and how to read the intent in a man's shoulders before he ever reached for a weapon. "The ring makes you a target," Etta said, her voice dropping to a low, gravelly hum as she watched me practice a defensive stance. "But the woman holding the knife? She's the one they'll fear. Don't just wear his name, learn to wield it." As I looked at my reflection in the blade, the girl who had spilled wine in terror felt miles away. I wasn't just under protection anymore. I was being forged. The stillness of the estate was shattered 2 days later by the arrival of a familiar face at the high-security gates. Marina Vale stood on the other side of the intercom, her signature blonde waves windswept, and her expression a masterpiece of practiced contrition. Against my better judgment, I told the security team to let her in, meeting her on the wide stone veranda that overlooked the manicured grounds. "Zuri, thank God," Marina breathed as she approached, her eyes darting greedily over my tailored silk blouse before landing on the diamond ring. She reached out as if to clasp my hands, but I shifted my weight, dropping my arms to my sides just as Etta had taught me. The movement was subtle, yet I felt the shift in power. "What are you doing here, Marina?" I asked, my voice devoid of the tremor that used to define our interactions. "I couldn't sleep." "I've felt sick ever since the gala," she said, her lip trembling with a delicacy that would have fooled me a week ago. "I didn't trip, Zuri. I was shoved from behind. It all happened so fast. And Caleb, he's been a monster. He's looking for you, saying you stole something from the restaurant's private office before you left with that man." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I want to help you. If you just tell me where you're staying, the actual address, not just this gated fortress, I can bring you your things. I can tell Caleb I found them in a locker. It would call him off." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, the mask slipped. I didn't see a friend, or even a jealous coworker. I saw the calculated tilt of her head, the way her eyes never quite met mine, and the slight bulge of a recording device in her designer clutch. She wasn't here to apologize. She was a bloodhound sent by Caleb to find the seam in the armor. "You're lying," I said, the words as cold and sharp as the paring knife Etta had put in my hand. Marina's face froze. "Zuri, how can you say you weren't shoved? You timed that trip perfectly to ruin me," I interrupted, stepping into her space. I watched her shoulders tense, a telltale sign of aggression I hadn't noticed before. "And Caleb doesn't want a stolen item. He wants a piece of property he thinks he owns. Go back and tell him the waitress is dead. Tell him the woman who replaced her knows exactly what he's hiding in that basement." The apology vanished from Marina's eyes, replaced by a hateful, jagged glare. She opened her mouth to retort, but a shadow fell over us. Lee Hiron appeared at the end of the veranda, her hand resting casually near her waistband. She didn't say a word, but the threat was physical weight. Marina scrambled backward, nearly tripping over her own heels. She didn't look back as she ran toward her car. I watched her go, my hand steady as I touched the ring. I wasn't a victim of her games anymore. I was the one playing. The heavy scent of stale grease and expensive floor wax clung to the back hallway of Hawthorne's, a smell that used to mean safety but now felt like a shroud. I slipped through the service entrance, my movements silent, shadowed by the lessons Etta had hammered into me. The restaurant was dark, the dining room a ghost of the opulence I had once served, but the air in the basement was thick with a different kind of darkness. I bypassed my old locker, ignoring the tattered sweater and spare shoes I had initially come for. My feet moved toward Caleb's private office, driven by a pull I couldn't explain the need to see the monster's face in his own handwriting. The lock yielded to the tension tool Hiron had slipped into my palm before I left the estate, a satisfying click echoing in the cramped corridor. The office was a shrine to unearned wealth, but behind a false panel in the mahogany desk sat a leather-bound book that looked older than the building itself. I opened it, expecting numbers or inventory. Instead, I found a ledger of names, ages, and arrival dates. It wasn't food or wine Caleb was tracking, it was people. My breath hitched as I flipped the pages, the ink blurred by my trembling hands. Each entry was a person who had disappeared from the restaurant's staff over the last 3 years, dishwashers, busboys, and girls like me who had no families to come looking for them. The dates lined up perfectly with the accidents and sudden resignations I had witnessed. Then I saw it, the final entry on the current page, dated for the night after the gala. Zuri Bennett, status, confirmed, delivery, post-shift. The realization hit me harder than any of Caleb's threats. He hadn't just been a cruel boss or a spoiled heir. He was a predator, and the restaurant was his hunting ground. The wine spill hadn't just ruined a dress, it had interrupted a transaction. If Jihoon hadn't stepped in, if he hadn't claimed me with that ring, I wouldn't be standing in a penthouse or learning to fight. I would be a line item in a ledger, sold to the highest bidder. I wasn't just a waitress who got lucky. I was a survivor of a trap I hadn't even known was set. As I tucked the ledger into my jacket, the weight of the diamond on my finger felt different. It wasn't a shackle anymore. It was the only thing that had kept me from falling into the abyss Caleb had dug for me. A floorboard creaked above me. I froze, my hand instinctively going to the small blade hidden in my waistband. The shadows of hawthorns were no longer my home. They were a war zone, and I had just stolen the enemy's most dangerous secret. The silence of the estate felt different tonight, heavy, like the air before a lightning strike. Jihoon had been gone for hours on a business matter he wouldn't discuss, leaving me under the watchful but distant eye of a skeleton security crew. I was in the library, the Ledger of Souls, hidden beneath a floorboard, when the first perimeter alarm bled into the night. It wasn't the rhythmic chime of a guest. It was a short, sharp burst, followed by a silence that was far more terrifying. I didn't wait to hear a second one. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hands remained steady as I reached for the small, weighted tactical pen Hiron had insisted I carry. The lessons in steel weren't just theories anymore. I moved to the hallway, staying low and away from the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows that now felt like transparent bullseyes. A dull thud echoed from the foyer, the sound of a heavy boot against mahogany. "Find her!" a voice rasped. It was a voice I recognized from the restaurant's loading docks, one of Caleb's regulars. "Boss wants the ledger and the girl. Kill anyone else." I felt a flash of cold fury. They weren't just coming for me. They were coming for the life I was trying to build. I retreated into the shadows of the darkened kitchen, the space where Etta had taught me to read reflections. In the polished surface of a stainless steel fridge, I saw a silhouette creep through the door, a silenced pistol leading the way. My breathing slowed. I wasn't the waitress who had spilled wine in terror. I was a ghost in my own home. As the man passed the kitchen island, I didn't scream. I moved. I stepped out of the darkness, using his own momentum against him. I drove the tactical pen into the soft tissue of his shoulder, exactly where Hiron had shown me the nerves clustered. He let out a choked gasp, the gun slipping from his numb fingers. Before it hit the floor, I kicked it away and delivered a sharp, palm-heel strike to his chin, snapping his head back. He went down hard, his head hitting the marble with a sickening crack. My hands were shaking, but my mind was a diamond, hard and clear. I heard more footsteps approaching, the heavy, uncoordinated rhythm of men who thought they were hunting a rabbit. They didn't know the rabbit had been trained by a wolf. I grabbed the fallen pistol, the cold metal a grim weight in my hand. The ring on my finger caught a stray beam of moonlight, a flash of fire in the dark. I wasn't just under protection. I was the protection. As the next shadow darkened the doorway, I leveled the weapon with a steady gaze. If Caleb wanted his ledger back, he was going to have to pay for it in blood. The heavy iron gates of the Hawthorne mansion groaned as they swung open, welcoming me back to the nightmare I thought I had escaped. Only this time, I wasn't in a server's uniform. I was draped in midnight blue silk, my hand clutching a clutch bag that held the Ledger of Souls like a live grenade. Caleb had played his hand with a coward's precision, sending a video of my grandmother's house surrounded by his men. The message was simple: the ledger for her life. The gala inside was a grotesque mirror of the night everything changed. The same amber lighting, the same smell of expensive perfume and hypocrisy, but the atmosphere was brittle. Caleb stood at the top of the marble staircase, looking down at the room like a king who hadn't realized his throne was rotting. When he saw me, a slow, jagged smile spread across his face. "The guest of honor has arrived," he announced, his voice amplified by the silence that followed my entrance. He descended the stairs, his eyes locking onto the diamond on my finger with a feral hunger. "You really thought a ring made you untouchable, Zuri? In this house, you're still just the help." I felt the eyes of the elite on me, the same people who had watched him drag me toward the exit weeks ago. I kept my chin up, my hand hovering near the hidden pocket of my gown. I wasn't here to negotiate. I was the bait for a trap Caleb didn't realize worked both ways. "Where is she, Caleb?" I asked, my voice steady enough to make him flicker with a moment's doubt. "Safe, for now," he hissed, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the center of the ballroom, right under the massive chandelier. "But Jihoon isn't. You see, Zuri, the beast is currently walking into the front door of my father's docks, thinking he's saving you. He's so blinded by this little fantasy of a fiancé that he didn't realize I'd bring you here instead." My stomach turned. I had sent the signal from the car, but the thought of Jihoon walking into an ambush for me made my breath hitch. Caleb leaned in close, his breath hot against my ear. "Give me the ledger, and maybe I'll let you watch him fall before I ship you out." I looked past him, toward the heavy oak doors at the far end of the ballroom. I didn't see Jihoon yet, but I saw the shadow of Lee Hae-rin slipping through the service entrance. The trap was set, but it wasn't Caleb's. I felt the weight of the tactical pen in my hair and the ledger against my ribs. "You always were a bad businessman, Caleb," I whispered, pulling the ledger from my dress and holding it up for the entire room to see. "You brought me into a room full of your investors. Did you really think I came here to give this back to you?" The doors at the front of the mansion didn't just open, they were kicked off their hinges. The silhouette in the doorway was tall, dark, and carried the weight of a storm. Yoo Ji-hoon hadn't gone to the docks. He had come for his own.
The crash of the oak doors echoed like a gavel through the ballroom, silencing the string quartet and the terrified murmurs of the elite. Ji-hoon stepped into the amber light, his presence draining the air from the room. He didn't look like a man who had walked into a trap. He looked like the man who owned the floor beneath our feet. Caleb's grip on my arm tightened, his fingernails digging into my skin, but his bravado was a crumbling facade. "You're too late, Ji-hoon. I have the girl, and I have the leverage. One word, and your fiancé disappears." Ji-hoon didn't stop walking until he was 3 feet away. He looked at Caleb's hand on my arm with a chilling, detached focus. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he reached for the top button of his suit jacket. The room went impossibly still. The guests leaned back, anticipating the draw of a weapon, the same way they had at the gala where this all began. "You think this is about a girl, Caleb?" Ji-hoon's voice was a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate the floorboards. He unbuttoned the jacket, letting it hang open to reveal the leather holster beneath his arm, but he didn't reach for the gun. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a stack of legal documents, bound in heavy blue ribbon. "I didn't just buy a ring, you arrogant child," Ji-hoon said. Tossing the papers onto the marble floor, they slid across the stone, stopping at Caleb's feet. The Hawthorne Empire was built on credit and secrets. Your father gambled with the wrong people, and 3 days ago, I bought every cent of his debt, every brick of this mansion, every port at the docks, and every soul in that ledger you're so desperate to hide, they all belong to me now. Caleb's jaw dropped. his hand finally slipping from my arm as he stared at the signatures on the documents. "That's not possible. The bank? I am the bank now," Ji-hoon interrupted, his eyes flashing with a predatory light. He stepped closer, his shadow swallowing Caleb whole. "By tomorrow morning, the police will have the copy of the ledger Zuri is holding. Your accounts are frozen. Your men have already been relieved of their duties by Hyrin. You aren't a king, Caleb. You're a trespasser in my house." The humiliation was absolute. Caleb looked around the room, searching for an ally among the guests he had spent years intimidating. But they all turned away, their eyes fixed on their champagne flutes, as if he had already become a ghost. Ji-hoon turned to me, his expression softening for the briefest of moments. He held out his hand, the tattoos on his knuckles, a dark contrast to the luxury of the room. "Come here, Zuri. We're finished here." I took his hand, the weight of the diamond ring finally feeling like a symbol of victory rather than a mark of ownership. As we walked toward the exit, I heard the first sob break from Caleb's throat, the sound of a man realizing that the world he had stolen was gone forever. The morning sun didn't just rise over the city, it claimed it, turning the skyscrapers into pillars of gold that mirrored the quiet triumph in my chest. I stood on the edge of the penthouse balcony, the wind whipping through my hair, no longer feeling like a guest or a ghost in someone else's life. Below us, the streets where I had once spent hours counting change for the bus were now just veins of a map I had finally learned to navigate. I looked down at my hand resting on the marble railing. The diamond caught the light, refracting 1,000 tiny rainbows against the stone. For weeks, the ring had felt like a heavy, foreign object, a shackle of protection, or a badge of a debt I could never repay. But as I watched the city wake up, the weight felt different. It felt earned. It was no longer a shield against Caleb, or a bribe for silence. It was a symbol of the space I had taken up in a world that had tried to erase me. It finally fit, not because the band had changed, but because I had. Ji-hoon stepped out from the glass doors behind me, his presence a familiar, steady heat in the cool morning air. He didn't say a word, but he didn't have to. He stood beside me, his tattooed hand settling over mine on the railing, his thumb tracing the edge of the ring. We stood there together, two people who had spent their lives fighting for control, finally finding a moment of stillness. "The Hawthorne name is being scrubbed from the buildings by noon," he said, his voice low and devoid of the iron edge it held for the rest of the world. "The archives are in the hands of the prosecutors. It's over, Zuri." I leaned my head against his shoulder, looking out at the horizon. I thought about Etta in the kitchen, finally free of the dish pit, and Hyerin in the foyer, a silent sentinel of a new order. I thought about the girl who had spilled wine and waited to be struck, and I realized I couldn't even remember the sound of her voice. "It's not just over," I whispered, turning to look at him. "It's a beginning." He looked at me then, his eyes reflecting the same golden light as the city at our feet. He didn't see a waitress he had rescued or a liability he had to guard. He saw a partner. I wasn't invisible anymore. I wasn't poor in spirit or in hope. As we looked out over the empire we had reshaped, I realized that the greatest power wasn't in the ring or the name. It was in the fact that, for the first time in my life, I knew exactly where I belonged.